I am. We are. This is Norwood.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of I Am Norwood. With me today is former longtime Norwood resident Jude Lamp, former head of the Norwood Historical Society, among other decorations she's had around town. Good afternoon, Jude. How's everything going by you?
Everything is fine here.
Excellent. So, as I mentioned offline, you've been recognized for as long as I've been here as essentially the historian or a primary historian about all things Norwood. When did you start living here? Were you a lifelong resident before moving recently, or?
I was a lifelong resident. The back of my birth certificate has the address 847 Blanche Avenue.
Okay, that's right near me. I'm on Tapan in Kensington there.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, where you live and where I lived was part of the Tapan patent. That was granted to 32 Dutch settlers, two families of which were Herrings, which is why Norwood was originally the Northwood section of Herring Township, which you now know as Harrington Park.
Right.
But Harrington Township was Harrington Park, Norwood, Northvale, Rockley, and I think part of Rivervale.
Okay.
And on very old maps, you will see there's Norwood and West Norwood.
What is West Norwood today?
It's all part of Norwood, but old maps listed as West Norwood. And when there was commuter service on the West Shore Railroad, that area was known as West Norwood, and the station stop was West Norwood.
Okay. Now, when you say the station stop, is that the one that's now by the post office or the one that's now by Broad Street?
It was the one along Broad Street.
Okay. Okay.
The tracks by the post office, that was the Erie line, not the West Shore.
Okay.
The West Shore went from Weehawken north, turned to the west, and terminated around Buffalo.
Okay. What became of the West Shore commuter line or line there?
Well, they stopped commuter service, I think in the late 50s, but that made Norwood very attractive because my father worked in New York City. So you took the train to Weehawken, the ferry across, and he was right at his office.
Okay.
The ferry terminal in Manhattan is now the Circle Line dock.
Oh, I got you. I wish we still had something like that here. I used to take the bus into the city when I first moved here. I've been here 10 years. And in bad weather, just simply wouldn't come. And that was pretty much it for my day. So.
Well, the other option, in my childhood, there was no passenger service on the Erie anymore, just freight.
Okay.
But people went down to what is now the Alpine Boat Basin. And all of that dockage, there was a ferry across to Yonkers, and you could take the New York Central down to Manhattan.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's the first I've heard of that, too.
Well, there was a funny story on Summit Street. I think the house is 123. There was a couple who lived there, and the gentleman was known to be absent-minded, but he worked in New York.
Okay.
So he took the ferry across to Yonkers, and he was the first car on the ferry. And it was a beautiful day, so everybody got out and stood by the rail, and the ferry docked, and he walked off the ferry and took the train and left his car and tied the ferry up for hours because they had to move the car.
Oops.
Major oops.
Oh, wow. Well, what do you remember as far as your childhood in Norwood and what the area was like and looked like and what you did around here? That's kind of a broad question, but I'll let you run wild with it.
Norwood was very small. Now, my parents were John and Lois Ehrman, and when I started school in 1956, my mother said there were 1,200 people in town. Now I got another figure of 1,500, but even so, that's pretty tiny.
Yes. Today's, I think, is projected 5,000 or 6,000, if I'm not mistaken.
I think we're over 5,000.
Right,
so
right.
Everybody, if you didn't know their names, everyone knew everyone else. And every mother, I swear, knew what every other mother's rules were. So if you crossed the street, you were not allowed to, and yes, I did it. By the time I got home, 5 mothers had called my mother to report that I had illegally crossed Tapan Road.
Streets are talking here. We're talking here back then.
Well, it was tougher back then. We had no traffic lights in town.
Right. I heard those were actually put in, or at least a few key ones were during one of the Falkenstern administrations, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm really not sure on that because there was only a blinker light at Livingston and Broadway.
That was the only one in town.
That was the only one in town. So crossing Pan Road or Livingston Street, you were taking your life into your hands. So you can see why the mothers would.
Pan Road and Broadway is still kind of bananas these days, so I can't imagine.
Well, it's even heavier traffic, more traffic then. But of course, Livingston Street with no traffic lights, that was a straight run to New York State. People went 60, 65 miles an hour.
Oh, wow. Yep, I can see that. What do people do for entertainment in town or leisure growing up in just in Norwood's confines itself?
Well, there were so many clubs. Norwood had a garden club. They also had what they called the studio club, which was artistic endeavors, and they put on plays.
Oh,
so
okay.
to us kids, Broadway was the neighbors' shows that the studio club put on. We thought they were marvelous. And of course, we had some rather really professional people in town. Harry Gorst, who was a crossing guard in front of Norwood School, he had been in vaudeville.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So of course, he had real theater experience.
Right.
And our music teacher, whose name escapes me, her husband was on Broadway, usually in stage choruses.
Okay.
I'm on a 3-day recall.
You want what you said?
I'm on a 3-day recall sometimes when in memory of names.
Okay.
But the kids played baseball, rode bikes. We played in the woods because, of course, like the development of Cobblestone crossing off South Avenue, that was all woods.
Okay. When was Cobblestone developed?
Oh, that was done in, I think, the early 80s.
Early 80s. Okay. I could see that from some of the houses. It looks relatively new overall, but a couple of ones look more dated than others. No offense to you Cobblestone folk that might be watching this eventually.
No, we were just surprised when it was built because the original master plan study for Norwood, that's wetlands in there.
Okay.
And that was always considered unbuildable because that was part of Hackensack Water Company's watershed. So everyone was stunned when they allowed building in there because it was swampy.
Okay. Do you recall any particularly big council or zoning meetings where they jumped into that, or?
I didn't at that time. I started to later.
Okay.
Because one of the things the Historical Society was hoping to do was save some of the older and very historic homes. Because we lost the Peter Herring house up on Pan Road. It was torn down.
What was that, real quick?
It was near the corner of Tapan and Hudson.
And who's Peter Aaron?
Peter Herring was a weaver.
Herring, there we go.
And they called him Peter the Weaver. He had the first jacquard loom in Bergen County.
Okay.
In fact, one of the coverlets that he wove is in the Chicago Art Museum.
Oh, wow. Wow. Interesting. He ran his business here, or he just lived here?
Oh, he ran his business there because I was able to see the house when it was on the market. And you can see where they had shored up the second floor because that's where he had the loom.
Okay.
A big loom is an extremely heavy piece of equipment.
Right.
And your jacquard loom was actually your first computer.
Oh.
Have you ever seen a loom?
I have. My mom had an older one growing up from my grandparents' house, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Right, they're upright.
Right.
They're tall. A jacquard loom, those warp threads are flat.
Okay.
And it's kind of a machine because it was operated with hooks. And there were cards with holes in them, which you ran through, and that stopped some of the hooks from coming up. So as you threw your shuttle, it knew where the colors should come up. So that was actually your first computer with punch cards.
Okay.
And if you ever go down to the Great Falls in Patterson, the museum there does have, or did have, a jacquard loom.
Okay. Now, was it gonna? You're getting into your history of government involvement, and I cut you off there to ask you about the house. You want to jump back in there?
We really started to go to the meetings when they started to tear down the historic properties, because Norwood has a history and it has a very colorful history.
Right.
But if you tear down the structure, I can tell you about Peter the Weaver, but his house is gone.
Right. That's residential now, I assume. Hall of Japan and Norwood is residential, except for the former Colonial Inn location, which is, I guess, now also residential. So,
but we were very fortunate because over on Blanche Avenue at 907, Norwood, in its early years, we're going back to the 1920s, we had an architect living in Norwood, which was big stuff.
Okay.
Because most of the jobs around here were either skilled craftsmen, there were small farms that people worked at. Other people worked prior to the Great Depression on some of the great estates there were in Englewood. I mean, those were estates with staff, like 9 or 10 people to run the house.
Okay.
So Norwood was not to have an architect. This was big stuff. And thanks to George Henshaw, we have the Norwood Library. And we were one of the first towns to have zoning ordinances, which are very attractive to builders, because then when you're selling a property, you can say, this is zoned residential. You're not going to have some sort of a business come in next door to you.
Right. Okay. Now, what roles did you have as far as official titles in terms of your volunteering here in town?
I was a historian for a year. Most of my work was volunteer with the Immaculate Conception School.
Okay. What'd you do there?
I was treasurer of the Parent Teachers Guild.
Okay.
And we used to, the churches in Norwood were very active in the crop walk. I was the treasurer of the Northeast Bergen crop walk for 18 years.
What is the crop walk?
That was a fundraiser. All the churches really in the area and the synagogues participated. It's like a clearinghouse. They were raising money, and from there, what they did in part of the money stayed locally to the shelter in Hackensack, but in a disaster someplace else, what would be done is, if it happened someplace, whatever organization had the infrastructure there to deliver aid, CROP would give money to them. So you might give it as a Presbyterian, but maybe the temple was spending it for all you knew, because that was where the disaster was. It was very popular, and for a number of years there, we were the #5 walk in the country.
Okay, what became of it? Is that something that's still being done in another form, or?
I'm not sure. The man who was running it was the Reverend Doster of the Norwood Presbyterian Church, and I think he's retired now.
Okay. What was I going to ask? And you grew up going to school here too.
Yes. Now here's another great story for you.
Excellent.
The school building that you see now, that was Norwood Public School #2.
Right.
The school across the street that's been torn down was Norwood Public School #1.
Okay.
Now, they wanted to build the school that you see there, and the original part of that was the all-purpose room, the offices, and that one line of classrooms down the front. Now, the rumor I heard, because this was discussed over the coffee cups and my mother didn't know that the little ears were wagging. The town, the date stone on that school is 1951. And they wanted to build a school prior to that. But the state would not allow Norwood to float a bond issue. And the reason Norwood was given was our population was too Italian.
Okay. What was that inferred to mean at that time?
Well, that was kind of pejorative. What they said was, in tough times, Italians don't pay their property taxes.
Okay.
But if we had a large Irish, and they would have let us, because the Irish will starve and pay their property taxes.
Oh, wow. That is an
political
interesting.
Political correctness was not the order of the day.
Well, New Jersey has a colorful history of politics in all facets, so that seems par for the course, unfortunately. But
well, George Henshaw wanted to see the Norwood Public School, the new building built, because he realized the town was going to grow. And he engineered the moving of the cookhouse off the site down the hill, across the street, and onto the corner of Summit and South.
Okay, what is the cookhouse?
Well,
What was it?
we didn't have door-to-door mail delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So you knew houses by who lived in them. And the cooks
Okay.
lived in that house.
Oh, I got you. So
that residential property was moved off its foundation, down the hill across the road, and it's on the corner of South and Summit.
is that, is that the one that's sort of behind the structure that's there now?
No, it's directly on the corner. It has a semicircular driveway. I think it's a rental property, and it was the original Norwood Public Library.
Okay, I've got the visual now. Excellent.
And of course, the Norwood Public Library, that was another George Henshaw idea. And it was, everybody brought books to contribute to the library in their wheelbarrows.
Okay.
And Ray Grill, who lived up on Japan Road, he built all the bookshelves.
Oh, wow. Okay. Everybody pitched in locally here.
They did. And the library was such a local thing. When I was a kid, we didn't have library cards. You went down to the library, and the lovely librarian was Mrs. Julick or Mrs. Brainerd, or Mrs. Seibel, and they just signed your name on the card in the book and took the card out because they knew all the kids.
Right. How would you describe the school back then, or the school system in town?
It was school. We thought it was. We thought it was fine.
Okay. Any interesting any particular annual events from the school, or I should say from the town, stand out to you from your childhood and that went on?
Well, the one I personally loved was the school every year had what they called the Fall Festival. It had games, and it had crafts, and they sold things and baked goods, and we all thought that was wonderful fun. And every one of the churches had a bazaar, which is also lots of fun. You did all your Christmas shopping, either at the Church of the Holy Communion Bazaar, or the Immaculate Conception Bazaar, or the Presbyterian Church Bazaar.
Okay. What about some of the local restaurants, night spots that were there as you grew up in town?
Oh, I don't know if there were really night spots.
Maybe not.
Up at the corner of Blanche and Tapan was Zinke's when I was a kid. It was a restaurant. That was in an historic Dutch house, and that burned. And unfortunately, there was someone who wanted to buy it and restore it. The county had a buyer, but the owner thought he would make more money with the builder, so it's gone.
Okay.
But that was also that structure itself had an interesting story, because I'm sure you know the story of Benedict Arnold.
Yep, of course, I know.
Right.
Yep.
Well, he was tried and hung in Tapan, New York.
Right.
After the Revolutionary War, the British wanted the body back, and he was exhumed, and the body spent a night in that building in Norwood that became a restaurant. It was a tavern, I believe, at the time. And the other story, which you can't confirm, but supposedly happened, is someone cut one of his toes off and still has it.
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
The body was repatriated to Great Britain, and if you go to Westminster Abbey, you will find along one of the walls its reinterment with a plaque.
Oh, wow. What about the toe? Any idea where we'd find that, whether or not you could tell us these days?
I don't know, and I forget the name of the family who supposedly has it. Mary Ann Clark of Demarest. She knows the story.
Okay. That's an interesting one. It sounds like an interesting segue into any random memorable stories you remember from or about townsfolk that you'd be willing to share on camera from growing up.
Oh, gosh.
Or legends, wherever we want to go.
The one that was public knowledge and spoken of for months. The PTA used to meet on Friday nights once a month. And a lot of the parents, of course, at the meeting because their children were in the school. This was in the 50s. And cars in the 50s, the gas tank covers were external. They didn't have doors on them. They were usually chrome and very visible. Well, while the meeting was going on, someone or someones took all the gas tank covers off all the cars parked on Summit Street and threw them onto the lawn of the cookhouse at the corner of South and Summit Street. So there was a big brouhaha, and people spoke of it for months because it must have been juvenile delinquents. Can you imagine?
Wow.
Some kids actually took people's gas tank caps off.
Wow. Never solved, never revealed who did what.
We never knew who did it.
Wow. So much for Ben Franklin's three keep a secret if two of them are dead.
You really wonder, but oh, I remember everyone was so upset. I mean, to think that children in Norwood would actually do something like that.
Oh, wow.
That was very major.
Okay. What was I going to say? What about as far as politics? Anything jump out to you from the decades you're in town?
You know,
Certain eras?
With our brouhaha over the election this year,
Yeah.
I remember one. This was back in the 50s. Mr. Wolf was mayor of Norwood, and I can't give you the dates. I'm not even sure I was in school.
Okay.
But he had been mayor and he ran for re-election. And his opponent was Mr. McIntosh. And Mr. McIntosh won, but he won with less than 10 votes.
Less than 10 votes total?
Less than 10 votes total. And the gossip behind the coffee cups when the borough council meetings was Mr. Wolf would go, and of course, Mr. McIntosh was presiding as mayor.
Right.
And when there was a discussion and a disagreement between Mr. Wolf and Mr. McIntosh, Mr. Wolf would remind Mr. McIntosh that he only won by a few votes. Now, you have to remember where the borough council chambers were.
Where were they at that time?
It was such a huge community. The firehouse on Broadway, there was a room on the second floor. Now, the building itself has been added onto and completely changed from what it looked like originally.
Right.
But on the second floor was a meeting room. And that's where the mayor and council met.
Okay.
That was where the school board met. That was where the Girl Scouts met. That was the place. It was also the police department and the ambulance corps.
Okay. All in one multi-use unit there.
All in one building. I think the police department only had 2 cells. I remember a big political argument on whether or not Norwood should buy a second police car.
Oh, wow.
Well, I heard somebody say, well, we only have 2 officers. Why do we need 2 cars?
I had more confidence in cars than I would have growing up.
Well, actually, the Norwood Police Department was a very forward-looking department. Chief Sposa, who I remember as a child, he used to come to school every year and teach us about bicycle safety.
Okay.
We all knew our hand signals before we even got our learner's permits. But during World War II, what happened is they just got radios. Well, the radios in the police car, if the officer called, that call went to Hackensack, and then they phone called Norwood.
Okay.
So obviously you have a problem there, and there used to be special officers, but with so many young men away in World War II, high school students manned that switchboard at the Norwood Police Department.
Oh, wow.
And they were the ones who radioed the car. They radioed the car.
Okay, put them to work early back then.
Well, it worked, and it was such an innovation that he was actually written up nationally for his idea. Nobody thought of that one.
Oh, wow. Okay. Since you mentioned it, war veterans from town, I know the building was named, the current Borough Hall has the name Frasco on it, and we have an American Legion. What can you tell me, putting you on the spot somewhat, but as far as notable veterans or a couple notable stories that came out of Norwood from the war years?
Oh, well, Mr. Parmisi, who is now no longer with us and used to work at the post office, he was a World War II vet. Mr. Wolf was a World War II vet, but he did not grow up in Norwood.
Okay.
In fact, Mr. Wolf was on the same Liberty ship with my father on the way to the invasion of Japan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But my father was not from Norwood either. He was from New York City.
Okay.
And of course, our one Gold Star mother growing up was a Frasco, and he was killed.
Right. you recall how that story goes? I know.
I heard the story. It was in Germany, and they had prisoners of war, and they had to move them across a river. And I believe they were doing it in a boat, and it capsized, and he was unable to swim, so he drowned.
Oh, wow. And is both, to your knowledge, is both the street and Borough Hall named after the same Frasco, or is it named after two different individuals?
As far as I know, it's the same one.
Okay, okay.
Because Miss Frasco, I believe, married Mr. Holman.
Okay, okay.
Who I went to school with Paul Holman. There were so many families, and they were so interconnected because the Falkensterns were related to the Hollahans, who were also related to the Wolves.
Right. And all those go
and
back
the
to
Sabastis were related to, oh gosh, I won't get them. There were a number of Sabastis, and that fanned out, and the same with the Parmeses, because they were related to the Engleharts.
Okay. So, and you have a number of those last names still ring out in town. So.
You had to be very careful who you badmouth, because you might be talking to their cousin.
Right, right. Do you remember any historic rivalries to that point that you'd want to say on camera? Or?
I really don't think so.
Okay.
Not on the rivalry. We had several political fights. The worst one, it was in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to build a second school.
Right.
And that actually, the bond issue was on the ballot, and it was voted down. And the feelings on that were very, very high, because the Episcopalian minister was so angry at its defeat. He gave an unpleasant sermon about that on Sunday. And he was blaming the Catholics for voting it down because we had the Catholic school.
Oh, no.
And whatever he said was so inflammatory. One of his congregants, who was married to a Catholic, got up in the middle of the sermon and said, "Well, you cash my husband's checks fast enough," and walked out.
Oh, wow.
So it could be a little bloodthirsty. And that one I know to be true because my mother was there for it.
Wow.
You notice we'll leave the names out.
Yes, yes.
And we had our tragedies too, because there was the Fimble family in town had one. Their son, Walter, he was considerably my senior, and I couldn't tell you how old he was. Their house was on Livingston Street, which I said was a really high-speed road.
Right.
People went 60, 65 miles an hour. He chased a ball into the street right in front of a car.
Oh, wow. What year was that? Or what time frame?
Oh, that would have been in the late 50s, maybe early 60s.
Okay.
And in fact, the statue in the parking lot of Immaculate Conception Church, that's there in Walter's memory.
Okay. There's a plaque on it?
Yes, there is.
Okay, okay.
I remember Walter. He was one of the big kids.
What do you mean?
He was.
Okay.
But the Fimbles were related to the Trouts, who were related to the Bobbishes. You see what I mean?
Yep, yep. They all connect.
They do.
Which other tragedies stand out to you? Not that we want to dwell on that too long, but it is really history. So
because Walter was one of us. He was a child.
Right. Any, I guess, scandal sheets sort of stuff? I know you and I alluded to that on email, but nothing we need to use the names of if needed. But anything jump out that really caught the town's attention as far as that goes at any point in time?
Yeah, there is, but I'm not sure what to tell that story.
Okay,
Let's go to some of the wonderful things Norwood residents did.
Excellent.
The house I sold on Summit Street was 120.
Okay.
That had been the home of Bill and Pauline Neckerman. See, this is the thing. With no door-to-door mail delivery, the house went by the owner's name.
Right.
So when somebody would ask me, who had been in town a long time, what house did you buy? I just said, we bought Neckerman's. And they'd nod and say, okay, I know where you live. But the Neckermans were a very, at that time, prominent family. That house was designed by George Henshaw, as were most of the houses on the block on Summit between South and Blanche Avenue. Let's tell the whole story.
Okay.
100 Summit was the home of Albert Pullman. Now, he was an interior decorator in New York City. He did hotels and restaurants, big
Oh, wow.
projects, and he worked with the rich and famous.
Hmm.
Now, on Blanche Avenue, I grew up next door to his grandson, George. So I was in and out of 100 Summit a lot as a child because Mrs. Vosser was always very sweet about giving out jelly bread around 11 o'clock.
Okay.
She made her own.
I'd be
Always
there
go for
too.
the best. But the Pullmans moved to Norwood and built a house between 1911 1912, and they bought most of the property on Summit. They owned on the opposite side of the street, 91 down almost to the school. That last house they didn't own. The
Okay.
Hakes lived there. Anyway, and on 120 side of the street, they owned from the Episcopalian Church down to, I think it's 122, the house next to me. Joan and Mike Roark live there now.
Okay.
But that was how George Henshaw came to Norwood, because Albert Pullman in the 1920s was a huge building boom. That's when they started building houses on Kensington and Somerset. That was a development. And the plans for that are in the Mac room down in Hackensack, if you ever care to go and look at it. But
Okay.
those were smaller lots and smaller properties. Albert was cutting off lots, and he asked George to design the houses because none of them look alike. And he did that on purpose because he wanted Summit Street to look really attractive.
Right.
And the first one built was the house the Daniels bought. And he went up the block. So that George Henshaw came to Norwood, saw the place, decided he liked it, and bought 3 acres that wrapped the corner of Summit onto Blanche, excuse me. And he built his house for himself at 907.
Okay.
The one to its right, he built for his sister. Interior, the house was identical, but he changed the facade again, so it didn't look like cookie cutters. And he also designed the same design as the Tops house around the corner on Summit.
Okay.
The Condoleos live there now. You may know him. He had been on the Borough Council.
Yep. I've met Ed. Yeah.
Those 3 houses, they were the same design, and he changed all the facades.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the name Henshaw. Is that related to Bill, the one that runs Norwood Swim Club?
Yes. Bill
Okay.
Henshaw is George's grandson. I tried very
Okay.
hard to get George's house on the New Jersey State Register.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I failed. But it's an important structure because when it was designed, when George designed houses, because I've been in all the Henshaw houses in Norwood, he designed each one of them to fit on the lot and make the best possible use of the natural light.
Okay.
Well, it cuts your energy bills.
That is true.
And his house, he designed to fit with the dimensional lumber at the time. So when it was built, there was very little waste.
Okay. Okay. What about the Norwood Swim Club? When did that get started here? Since we're thinking, I've got Henshaw on the brain now. So.
I think around 1965, my family were not involved with that and weren't interested in it.
Okay.
My husband and I we were members for a while, but that wasn't a big thing.
I'm gonna try to grab Bill for an interview. Bill, I want to get you for an interview if you're watching this.
Well, you see, George Henshaw was a very important person. Besides the fact he was an architect, he was our code official for, gosh, I guess over 30 years. I mean, after all, as an architect, he certainly would understand how a house should be built.
Right, right.
And he was a very hands-on architect. If he did draw plans, handed to the builder and see you later. 110 Summit Street, which my parents eventually owned, they bought that in 1970. The fireplace in the living room, when the stonemason put it in, he did not follow George's design, and George made him take it out. So he put it in again, and he still didn't follow the design, and George made him take it out again. The third time he realized he was going to have to follow the design.
What? Or is it still pending to this day?
Well, the one thing, George knew how to design a fireplace. Believe me, they draw beautifully.
Nice.
And not every fireplace does.
No, we to that point we have tremendous problems with ours. So I can appreciate one that lights easily. That's for sure.
Well, George's fireplace is lit. Now his daughter was Alice Jones.
Mm-hmm. One of the Jones property. What's that?
Walter and Alice Jones bought the house at the corner of Broadway and Tapan,
right.
The one that's up on the hill.
Right.
Walter H. Jones, when I was a kid, was big stuff because he was a New Jersey state senator.
Oh, okay.
But when they bought that house, during the Great Depression, actually, Norwood was kind of a summer community.
Okay.
There were summer bungalows, and people with money built some of those Second Empire and Queen Anne homes that you see.
Right.
In fact, there had been many more. I was looking through the Norwood Borough Council minutes, looking for when the zoning code was actually put in. P.S. I didn't find it, but I found other interesting things. One of them was there were many more Queen Anne and Second Empire houses. They were torn down during the Great Depression because people couldn't afford them. They abandoned them. And with 2 train lines, you had the transient population getting off in Norwood and taking over some of these abandoned homes.
Oh, no.
And the town felt for the safety of the residents, they had to demolish them.
Right.
Because every now and then a picture postcard will turn up of a house that no longer exists. The other thing George did, which I thought was a shriek and a half, in the 20s, Norwood put in an ordinance that you are not allowed to let your goats or your dogs sleep in the street.
Is that still on the books to your knowledge?
I don't know, but I thought that was hysterical. Obviously, it was a major problem.
Yeah, I've heard some interesting things during my term on the council, but anybody complaining about goats not being appropriately situated in the nighttime was not one of them.
Well, obviously, there was a problem with the animals sleeping in the street. Oh, here's another political one for you. I ran across this. I don't remember the name of the mayor, but it was a January council meeting, new mayor, new council. And the mayor was complaining that the preceding administration hadn't, this was in the 1920s. Now, remember, electricity was coming to Norwood and they were beginning to pave the roads.
Right.
And Orange and Rockland had billed the borough of Norwood for putting in poles and electrical wiring on Burlington Street, and the bill hadn't been paid. So the new mayor was criticizing old mayor for not paying the bill, which was hefty, and this was going to impact the borough budget. The next borough council meeting, the prior mayor was there and said, wait a minute, the residents of Burlington Street paid for the poles and the electrical lines coming in.
Right.
O&R was a double billing.
Ooh.
So there's always been billing issues as long as there have been people to make up bills.
Wow. Where the items you were sifting through, the records and the minutes, where would you find those today? Just so everybody else could know.
Oh, they're in Borough Hall.
Okay. And you would just, are they on microfilm or in hard copy right now, or?
Well, when I was looking at them, they were on hard copy.
Okay.
Oh, another political thing, the Hake House next to Norwood Public School. He was the tax collector for many, many years. And finally, one of the ordinances, they stipulated that no one could go and try and pay their taxes on Sunday. It seemed the tax office was Mr. Hake's living room. Yeah. And people just showed up any old time and paid their taxes whenever it suited them. So at least the Hake family finally got Sundays in peace.
Oh, wow. Well, that's, yeah. Believe me, I have my own law firm, and I try to block out days and hours where no one's bothering me, so I can definitely understand their concern, even if they're inviting it for a while. So,
well, no one thought of this. Everybody knew everybody else.
Right.
I imagine the delinquency notice is if you ran into it and said, hey, you know, your property taxes are due and you haven't been by. Right.
One thing that's come up a lot in the storytelling I've heard since I've been here, and this is my 10th year here. I'm a relative new jack, so to speak, but I've heard some interesting here and there about the Prohibition era. Is that something you've heard anything about? Or
I did. Now, the house that's on the corner of Rivervale and Tapan, Rich and Lee Williams own that. That was supposedly a speakeasy. And from
okay, I know them.
that's another herring house. With all the doors in that house, I'll bet it was.
Okay.
And the story that former Mayor Derek Cole told was there was supposedly a tunnel that ran from their farm stand down to the railroad tracks.
Right.
And they were supposedly shipping it. The other one I heard is that at one time the sisters to teach Sunday school at Immaculate came out from the city. And the man who drove them had a great big Buick. And when he took them back in, the booze was in the trunk. Because who was going to stop a man who was driving a car full of sisters?
I love that.
But those are the only, well, that's the only Prohibition stories I heard, and who knows if they're true.
Right.
Supposedly some bootlegger buried his money on somewhere over near the railroad tracks. People hunted for it, they never found it. So nice story, no accuracy.
Right. Well, to that point, actually, in the last interview I did, it was alluded to that there's a time machine, time capsules buried somewhere from the early 2000s outside of Borough Hall. Was that something you were involved with as part of the Historical Society? Or
no, we weren't around in the early 2000s, and no, I knew of it, but I wasn't involved with it. That was done by the group that was organizing the booklet and the parade and all of that.
Okay. Do you know what year it's supposed to be pulled out, or do I have to keep sniffing around?
I'm afraid you're going to have to keep sniffing around.
Gold rush, everybody. Go dig up Borough Hall. No.
I don't think that's advisable.
No, don't do that. That's very unofficial recommendation.
But those are the biggest things that stick out in my mind. Norwood was a nice, homey town. It was a place, if you moved in, all the neighbors arrived with sandwiches and cookies to ask you how old your children were.
Okay. So give us some quick addresses. Where are the historical houses, whether or not they're labeled today? Just to recap, you alluded to a few throughout the last minutes here.
Teeter's house that's out, I think, on 14th.
Okay.
The Cushieres, they're the ones who have it now. The Dutch Stone House at the corner of Kensington and Tapan. The Pullman House at 100 Summit Street would come under that is being historic due to its age. Okay. It's an American Foursquare, and the pillars that were originally at corners of the property on either side of the driveway, they were from the late 1800s and came from a building in New York City.
Okay.
And the only other thing I can tell you is, so many of the things are gone, is there's a Bergen County site survey in the Norwood Library, and they will tell you that. And when I think of it later, I'll email you with addresses.
Okay. Because
so many of the things have either been unsuitably altered, like the Norwood Firehouse. As it was originally, it would have been National Register worthy.
That's the next and perhaps one of the final categories I'd want to get into. Unfinished business. What should be preserved in town that you think should be, I should say, what do you think should be preserved in town that has not been as of yet, or designated as a landmark, or otherwise? It is not
preserved, because this is the thing that's very interesting. Now, my late husband was successful in his New Jersey State Register nomination. The Norwood Presbyterian Church is on it. So is the Church of the Holy Communion. That is not a protection. Even if you're on the National Register of Historic Places, it is not a protection. The only protection comes from a local ordinance.
Okay, so you would...
Because, for example, Mount Vernon, now everybody's going to agree that's an important structure, home of George Washington. Yep. It's owned by the ladies of Northern Virginia. And if there's no local ordinance, they can tear it down anytime they want.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Well, that's a message to the new council, because I'm off as of January. So. But
but what's interesting, because that is a state and a national designation, it does help the property in one respect. For instance, part of the nomination is the structure in its original location.
Okay.
So you may have a historic building, but if you move it to save it, it's less likely to be acceptable on the National Register.
Oh, okay.
Just like if you ever go down to Newbridge Landing in River Edge,
Right.
there's a Demarest house there. That is not its original location. It was saved from a builder by the David Demarest chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and they paid to have it moved there. But if you tried to get on the register, you might have trouble.
Okay.
But what you can stop, the Church of the Holy Communion is on the National Register. If the town decided to widen Summit Street 15 feet on the church side, the church could stop you from that, because that would, it changes the location of the structure and would impede its historicity.
Okay. Okay.
And the other thing Norwood did, which they took it down and they did put it back, but we still have a couple fire gongs.
Fire what?
Fire gongs.
Okay. Where are those located?
Well, across the street on Summit from the Church of the Holy Communion, there is what looks like a round tire with a cut in it. And that was the fire alarm. They took the hammer away because the kids kept hammering it while church services were going on. That hoop is a worn out locomotive tire.
Okay.
But that was your fire gong. And it originally was lower to the ground, so kids would sit on it. And quite a number of romances were conducted sitting on that fire gong.
Duly noted. Interesting. That's one of those things I see in town, and it just never occurred to me either way why it was there. I just kind of accepted it was there. So that's an interesting fact.
Well, that was it. Norwood, our phone system wasn't that wonderful when my parents moved in. You could not get a private line in Norwood.
Huh.
And you're too young to remember it, but when the telephone company came out with colored phones with a lighted dial, everybody was so excited. You couldn't have one in Norwood. We weren't wired for it.
Oh, wow. I grew up, I had rotary phones when I started, but I was out on Long Island at the time. But,
when I started, they weren't rotary phones. You picked up the phone and the lady said, "Number, please."
Okay.
And our exchange was Closter.
Okay. Okay.
We were Closter 5.
Interesting. Wow. Any other interesting categories I didn't necessarily cover that you'd want to make sure?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Norwood was a wonderful place to grow up. It was friendly, it was warm, it was inviting. And my children pointed out to me that the Norwood they grew up in was not the Norwood I grew up in.
How so?
Well, it was bigger. There were more people. People didn't know each other and made no effort to either. When we bought our first house, when somebody down the street moved in, I went down with a plate of cookies like everybody always did.
Right.
And I was greeted with great suspicion. And I thought, okay, we don't do that anymore.
See people opening them afterwards.
They probably thought I was casing the joint. I don't know.
Right.
But it's a different time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you gave us a lot to think about here. So, and I don't want to keep you the whole day. We've been going nearly an hour at this point. And
well, I will send you a listing of the important structures in Norwood. Thank you.
Thank you. And I thank you for your time today. And, you know, we'll probably put this up for viewing in a matter of weeks. If people have more questions, are you game for coming back would be my last question.
Possibly. And I also suggest you talk to Chuck Dearborn.
Chuck Dearborn?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. If you know where to find him, you please email me that as well. What's that?
He grew up in Norwood. His father built the house he's currently living in.
Okay.
His father also built 220 Summit.
Isn't there a street Dearborn in town also?
No, that's in Old Japan. See, the Dearborns were related to the Svans. And the Svan, Mr. Svan built 91 Summit. He did a lot of building in Tenafly and Rockland County. And even to this day, you will see homes advertised in Rockland County that it's a Svan home. That was known for its pride of craftsmanship and quality of building. The same thing with Mr. Dearborn. He had a development in Old Japan.
Okay.
But Chuck may know more than I do, because boys were allowed to range further afield than girls were when I was a kid.
Okay, I guess to that point you didn't go hunting when you were younger in town either. Huh?
I wasn't allowed to, but I remember when I was in 4th grade, New Jersey banned leg hold traps. And there
Okay.
were a number of boys in my class who were very upset because they were running trap lines and selling the pelts.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting little business. You don't see around here these days either.
Well, the woods are gone.
Yep. Other than some preserved lands.
We never saw deer when I was a kid.
Really?
No.
Okay.
They didn't have to pillage people's yards.
I guess that's true. Yeah, we get several every season. So and groundhogs for that matter, which
we took their habitat.
Right.
So they adjusted to us.
Right. So, and I guess Preserve Woods Barry already went through with me, so I won't subject you to history questions on that. That was a big project of his.
I know.
But thank you again. This has been excellent. I'm sure everybody's going to be interested to hear these stories and more as I put them out here. So, and that's why I'm doing it.
Well, I thank you. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I hope people love Norwood in the same way that I did. It was a wonderful place to grow up and to live and to raise children.
That's my opinion. 1 decade in, so stay tuned.
I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.